We have people starting to log in. Wonderful. Welcome everybody out there. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes.
I taught my last language testing class, Anthony, this week. The last beginning English language testing class.
Well, we'll invite you to teach a few more classes.
Okay. But I won't have to grade any more papers.
Yeah. How many people are going to be watching, Sophie?
The webinar we have, I think we have about 200 registered. So
Just to make you a little nervous, Jim.
Oh my God, 200?
It's not quite 200, but it's up there near 200. So
so you see, Sophie, I'm still getting these notifications. They'll drive me crazy.
I'm not seeing any notifications for what it's worth.
I just saw one.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't see one pop up, but we've got a good luck Jim from Payman Vafi in the crowd, in the chat. Right. Welcome to those of you just joining us. We've got some hellos in the chat. Hi, everybody. We'll get started in just a few more minutes.
Oh, it's kind of cool. I'm seeing people from all over the place.
Yeah. Yes, we have more and more people logging in all the time. So I know this gets started at 1:30. I'm going to give everybody just a few more minutes since we just hit 1:30 to log in, and everybody can join us. And then we will begin.
The hardest thing is finding the link.
Can everybody out there hear us okay? Is the sound good? You can indicate in the chat if it's good or not good. Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you. All right. Wonderful. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to give it just one more minute, but while we're waiting, I'm going to launch just sort of an introductory poll, just to sort of take stock of those of you joining us today, how familiar you are with scenario-based assessment, which will allow our speaker to better tailor his talk to you. So you should see that poll having just popped up now. And if you just want to weigh in so we can kind of gauge the audience out there. While we're waiting for people to join us, I will just say, so we're hosting this on Zoom webinar, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with Zoom out there. What's a little different about Zoom webinar is that as audience members, you're not able to have your camera on or speak, which is unfortunate. However, we do have a half hour reserved at the end of this talk where we can field questions either via the chat. Feel free as you're watching to add questions to the chat. We'll be taking stock of those. And then there's a kind of a Q&A feature that we can use too. So we will make time to answer questions, but just the format of this, we'll probably keep it. We'll save all the questions for the end, but as you think of them, please feel free to share them. More and more people are joining us. Fantastic. Got 77% responding to our brief little one question poll. And so we have a few more polls throughout the webinar for you. So keep your eyes peeled for that. It should just pop up pretty easily for you to interact with it. That's the best way we can have audience interaction during the talk. So thanks for responding to that. It's 2 after, so I think we should get started. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share the results. So here in the crowd, we have, can you guys see this? We have about 61% of our people who answered said that they are familiar with scenario-based assessment. We've got about a 60-40 split, if that informs that informs you moving forward.
Just what I figured. That was just what I figured, Sophie.
Excellent. Okay. Well, then at this point, I'm going to hand it to my colleague, Anthony, and he will introduce our speaker for today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar from Duolingo. This is the second in the series. And today's speaker is James Purpura from Teachers College, Columbia. We call him Jim. So I'll introduce him as Jim. Jim has had a very wide-ranging and respected career as a teacher, as a researcher, as an editor, and as an organizer of events and conferences, two notable ones, one in Barcelona and one in Palermo. He's the author of a very widely read book called Assessing Grammar, and he is embarked on many collaborative projects and conference presentations in various parts of the world. He's most recently done work in Costa Rica and Mexico. He dragged me to Italy 4 years in a row. He's also done work in the Arab world, and he's come to Macau for a conference. And of course, he's a frequent presenter at the ALTE meetings in Europe. So Jim is no stranger to any language testing person in the world, so I will not say more. You can read his bio, elsewhere. So welcome, Jim, and I'll hand you over and go for it.
Okay, thank you, Anthony, very much. Sophie, Anthony, thank you, and Duolingo guys for inviting me to do this webinar. It's an honor to do this and to reach out to so many people all over the world. I just want to begin by also thanking Teachers College, an anonymous donor, for their support in this project and scenario-based language assessment, which began about, I don't know, maybe 8-10 years ago. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about because it brings together pedagogy and assessment and instruction and learning, and so brings them all together. So today I'd like to just talk about how we use a learning-oriented assessment framework to rethink, reimagine how we might do classroom assessments by means of scenarios. And so let me just go ahead and begin. This work is not just my work. I have to give credit to my collaborators as well in the English scenario-based assessment, and also those who are doing the Korean, Persian, Italian, and Arabic scenario-based assessment as well. And also, I just want to say that teaching these classes over these years has also contributed to what I know collectively on this topic. So today, what I'd like to do is I just want to take a moment and think a little bit about the landscape of second and foreign language use. And then I'm going to use an anecdote to illustrate what a scenario is and how it can be used to measure situated second and foreign language proficiency. This might be a new term for some of you. Mostly we talk about second and foreign language proficiency, but I'm talking about situated, and how we do this in a collaborative problem-solving scenario. I'm going to also use this anecdote to highlight the dimensions that are tapped into when we actually do collaborative problem solving, and this will let me introduce the learning or an assessment framework as an assessment design framework. And then I'll describe scenario-based language assessment itself and provide an example of this. So a lot of people have asked me for an example, and I'll go through the example and some of the features, and then we'll take just a glimpse at the scoring rubrics we've used and some of the score reports we've come up with. And then finally, I'm going to, since most of the previous work is in the context of a placement exam, and it's a broader topic. It's still related to classrooms, but it's broader. In the end, I'm going to show how we might reimagine a traditional classroom achievement test and how we can make that learning oriented and scenario based. So that's it. So fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to move on through these different parts. If you have questions or comments, I will be periodically stopping. So put them in the chat box and I will address them. All right, so let's just talk first about how we use language in the real world these days. Okay, so one thing is, over the years, we know that the sociolinguistic, economic, and political and technological forces in our daily lives, in our school, and where we work, they've really contributed to a whole different range of competencies that we need to function successfully in this increasingly interconnected, diverse, and politically charged world. And what I mean by that is, by success, I mean language needed for gainful employment, health and safety, social cohesion, equity, human rights, and we can list a whole other types of things. But what we do with language, a foreign language, for those of us who speak them, has really changed over the years. So for example, many of us need to use a foreign language in socio-interpersonal contexts to establish and maintain nourished friendships with family, friends, or we use them in social transactional contexts to carry out routine transactions in everyday settings and in person online. We use them in academia, of course, to read, listen, and synthesize information from sources, share this information by writing or speaking, and we do what we do right now in professional domains to process and evaluate information, use it to reason so we can find solutions, share these solutions, and often we do all of this in multicultural teams. And all of it, most of us, I think, out there right now have had experiences in doing some of these things in a foreign language. So the starting point of SBA, scenario-based assessment, is the belief that humans are constantly maneuvering situations that require goal-oriented, meaning-focused actions, and to successfully perform these actions, we need language, of course, but we also need topical resources. But these two alone really are not enough. We need to be able to marshal these resources along with other cognitive, contextual, and dispositional resources to be able to solve simple and complex problems. In other words, we need the capacity to develop and deploy a wide range of competencies so we can use these competencies flexibly, across different contexts. So what do I mean by competency? It refers to the ability to marshal and deploy, often over time, a coherent set of foundational resources, often referred to as enabling skills, in order to accomplish these valued real life goals, or some people call them products, both within situations and across situations. Okay, so how do we align this then with education? Okay, so basically we have this whole set of real life competencies out there, and we've chosen a collaborative problem solving competency to look at because it's basically one of the top 10 that have been, survey after survey, it comes up as one of the top 10. So we decided to look at that. And what we're really trying to do here is prioritize authenticity and generalizability. So in the real world, we need to use these cooperative problem solving, and then we should have opportunities to learn to solve problems collaboratively in education. And if that happens, then we need to be able to assess the examinee's ability to use a second foreign language in order to solve problems collaboratively. So the three things kind of connect and align with each other. And that's really what, as language teachers, as language testers, that's really what we're interested in here. So the goal here is to explore the possibility of creating and delivering complex computer-delivered assessments that are capable of measuring the examinee's ability to use his or her proficiency, along with these other resources, to solve a problem collaboratively. And we do this with an imaginary group of peers online. This is not sitting face-to-face to another person. It's an imaginary group that we've already programmed in there. And they do this throughout the course of the assessment. So unlike traditional skill-based assessments, these assessments are engineered to measure situated second language proficiency because they occur within a sociocultural context of second and foreign language use, where the ability to accomplish a sequence of simple and complex tasks is firmly embedded within the mediated engagements and social interaction practices of a particular community. And you'll see what I mean a little bit later by that. So three questions we might have is, if we organize assessments around the complexities needed in situated second language performance, what are the interpretive values that are interpretive value that's going to be added to these assessments? How can we engineer them to get an evidentiary basis of these interpretations? And then what are some of the challenges? And you'll see as we go along. So I want to begin with an anecdote. I just want to introduce you to my friend Alfred. He's Catalan. He lives in Barcelona, speaks Spanish. He's a long-term friend, and he's a really fantastic travel buddy of mine. We've gone on many, many trips. And, speaking about the pandemic and stuff, we decide we might often take a week off and go places. And so this time we wanted to go someplace, and he found some ads, and basically he wanted to go to the all-inclusive luxury resort in Cancun. Okay, they're fantastic. I've been to them. And I wanted to go to Istanbul, where it's just full of culture and food, and food always trumps everything else for me. So I really wanted to go there. So what we had to do is we had to kind of like argue back and forth, not argue in a bad way, but basically convince each other to which trip would be the better trip for us at this particular point in time. This was all done over Zoom. It happened over several days. He went out and looked for information about Cancun and to convince me, and I went out and looked for information about Istanbul to convince him. And then we had to come together and negotiate this. So this was done for me in Spanish or Catalan. For him, he was doing it sometimes in Spanish, Catalan, and also in English. So it was really a multilingual type of situation where we use languages. So a lot goes on when we're trying to do this in a foreign language. And so what I'd like to do first is just tell you that this is an example of a scenario. So according to O'Reilly et al., a scenario is a description of an internally consistent set of naturally occurring or imagined scenes or events in which characters carry out actions and interact with each other until they bring this to a solution. And given that scenarios are proxies for real life situations, they can be used to create a context in which participants, Alfred and me, need to use our mental, social, and dispositional resources to perform a series of carefully sequenced tasks to achieve our goal of coming up with a solution in the end. Okay, so the great thing about scenarios is they're naturally flexible in that they can present straightforward scripts with very few complications, or they can be manipulated to present storylines with really surprising features, novel insights, shifts in values or perspectives, feedback that can change things, and so forth. So similar to real life, just about anything can be modeled to create an interesting dynamic scenario. So in the following slides, I'd like to present Carolyn Turner and our framework of learning-oriented assessment to characterize the dimensions that actually come into play in this vacation scenario, so you can get a flavor for what's actually going on. This same framework, remember, should be aligned with pedagogy and assessment of these and things that we do in real life. So this framework can be used for all three cases. So let's just start. So I'm going to stop here first, and I just want to ask you a question. So Sophie, if you can launch this poll here.
Okay, so you guys should all see this same question in the poll box, and you can choose all that you think apply. And we've got answers rolling in, so I will just alter the camera. I'll give folks a chance to reply, and then I'll end it and share the results here in a minute.
So you're going to end it and share the results now, or?
We've got well, no, I'm going to give people a chance. We got about 56 respondents, so I'm going to give it a little longer.
So you can put as many as you want here.
The answers are rolling in. I'll leave this open for just another moment. We've got almost everyone has responded. I'm gonna go ahead and share it. We got almost 90% responded. So,
Okay, cool.
all right, so let's share this out.
Okay, all right. So, affect management. Yep. Oh yeah. Ability to collaborate. Interesting. Ability to code switch between Spanish and Catalan and English, to engage foreign language resources, background knowledge, ability to process new information and feedback. So actually, I think the right answer is that all of them are possible. Okay, all of them are possible, and you'll see this as we move along with the presentation. Okay, so basically, when we have this situation, what are the complexities of using Spanish for me in this real life problem solving scenario? And if we do use this for assessment, how can we engineer tasks to elicit situated second language proficiency in this really highly contextualized dynamic situation? So what's going on with this? So the first thing, obviously, is there's a context here. It's a vacation, a vacation context. And so we have a topic is vacations. It's a real life. We got some real life communication goals of persuading each other. It's friend to friend. We're socializing, but we're also making some travel decisions. And also in this context, we're meeting several times online. It's social interpersonal, but it's also social transaction because we need to get something done. And then in terms of the competencies needed for me, I need to be able to use Spanish to learn about a destination online. I need to learn about another destination from Alfred when he's talking to me about one. And then I need to provide a convincing argument in favor of my preferred destination. So there's a lot going on in terms of the competencies I have. So when we think about the contextual dimension, we think about the sociocultural context in which this takes place, the real life topics, scenarios, tasks, and competencies that are in real life really being tapped into and generalizable too. And so these are design features, obviously. Another thing that's going on in this is we need to elicit the performance. So scenarios are organized around what's called a scenario narrative. These are really the habits of mind for solving a problem. So for example, Alfred shares an ad for a low-cost customizable vacation package. Both of us discuss these two destinations. We disagree. So there's an opportunity for assessment of reading and also an assessment of speaking. Each of us decides to research one of the destinations online and summarize our takeaways. So there's opportunity for integrated reading and writing. And then each of us uses information to convince each other in a video recorded text message. This is opportunity for speaking, measuring speaking. And then Alfred emails me to concede, but asks for some trip adjustments. Okay, and I offer them to write a detailed email to the agency reflecting our collective wishes. So again, there's an opportunity to measure reading and there's an opportunity to measure writing. And so these are the kinds of tasks that we would have. So when we think of the elicitation dimension, we think of the blueprint, we think of test specs, we think of online delivery, assembly delivery, and all of the stuff that we typically think of when we think about language testing. Okay. By the same token, Alfred and I had to draw on a wide range of content and use multilingual resources to do this problem-solving task. So this brings us to the proficiency dimension. Okay, so it's tapping into some of our foundational linguistic resources that we have: grammar, vocabulary, information about the topic, pragmatics. Also, our ability to use these in reading or listening, speaking and writing, and more complex, the ability to integrate these and do this in a sustained situation over time. Okay, so this is really a different way of thinking about proficiency when we have situated proficiency here. So when we think about this dimension, we think about the linguistic pieces, the performance standards, learning progression, some of the very typical things that we usually think about when we think about assessment as well. And these are some design considerations here. By the same token, when we're doing this, the social and mental resources Alfred and I need in order to be able to engage either alone or collaboratively in the problem solving, this is also being tapped into. Okay, we need our brain to function here, and and we need to learn from each other as well. So there's a socio-cognitive dimension here, where I have to remember things that Alfred tells me, things that I've read. I need to process things online by reading, maybe reasoning. And I need to do this in a situated context. It's a distributed cognition. I need to do it alone and with him. And this changes the nature of cognition in this case. So when we think of this dimension, what's being tapped into here is there's attention span, memory capacity, some processing things, reasoning and retention, and then these different types of cognition here. Also, from the instructional dimension, Alfred and I presented each other with information. We sometimes also assisted each other with language and content, either with my Spanish or his English. And sometimes if there was an informal language lesson, that wouldn't have been unnatural. So what does that mean? And teaching me something. So there's an instructional dimension to this as well. So we use information that we get as instruction. Sometimes, there are some graphics or the ad that was glosses. This is also assistance as instruction. Feedback to me from Alfred and vice versa. This is also can be instructional. And sometimes, as I said, there might be a little Catalan lesson here and there that might have been informally embedded into our interaction. So when we think of the instructional dimension, if we think of the presentation of information to be processed, remembered, and used later on. This is a dimension that's not typically associated with assessment, but it is certainly a part of language use. So these are some design considerations as well. Also, we did this in a social context. Alfred and I, we've been friends for a long time. We fluidly moved between 2, 3, sometimes 4 cultures. He speaks Italian very well. We understand and exploit interactional practices, and we're sensitive to each other's languages and the languages and cultures. So there's a social interactional dimension going on here as well in order to get this work done. There's a social contract here by putting this in a social culture context. Both individually, we have our own individual identities, but we also have, we come from cultures. And then he and I are friends, so there's basically symmetry here, but you could have asymmetrical social contract as well in these scenarios. And then this affects the interactional practices that we have, right? How we talk to each other, our turn taking, how we do talking interaction. So when we think of this dimension, we think of that social contract, and we think of some of the interactional practices that's associated with it. So again, when you embed this in a sociocultural context, these are design considerations that need to be taken into account. And of course, everything revolves around affect, right? Alfred and I, orient towards an interesting vacation. We want to have fun together. We're accommodating and considerate to each other. We want to have a good time. And we like being with each other. So there's a really nice social affective dimension that's flavoring this. So we're very highly engaged in this. We trust each other. We want to have fun. We cooperate with each other. And as a result, we're willing to take the extra work to go and hunt things down and just be accommodating to each other. So when we think of this dimension, we think of what's being triggered in this context of triggering the psychological, social, and behavioral dispositions and attitudes that people have when they come to this kind of an assessment. And then thanks to AAAL, where I saw all these fabulous talks from my friends actually at Duolingo, there's a dimension that I've been ignoring for many years, and that's the technological dimension, because everything that we do now is really associated, or many things we do are associated with doing them online. So Alfred and I did this online, and we need to be able to use the internet to get information, to communicate online. So there is obviously a technological dimension that's being tapped into here. We're tapping into the digital literacy skills and their familiarity with ICT and with and their ability to train in that, their access to training, and also the entire, all of these different dimensions are organized through technology. So this is a consideration that I've kind of added into this, into the framework here. So when we think of that, we think of the ability to use ICT and digital literacy. And this, I have to say, is the least thought out part of the learning-oriented model, but this will be fleshed out better later. So if you think of this, you can think of these, the traditional 7 dimensions of learning-oriented assessment and how they can be conceptualized separately, but also how they definitely interact with each other. And then the new dimension of the technological dimension as well, that needs to be considered in all of this. So we use this as a framework to design our assessments, okay? And also as a framework for validating them, because these are the questions that we have in the end. And a little bit more later on that. So many approaches actually can be used to design scenario-based assessments. We chose this one because it forced us to acknowledge and design for the different dimensions in the assessment event. In other words, the framework organizes assessment around the specification of activities that elicit performance indicators situated within a clear sociocultural context. It also forced us to acknowledge and account for performance moderators within that language use event. So these related to the instructional role of input, which is not normally thought about in an assessment, the processing of this input, the role that affect plays in task engagement, the role and the social and interactional practices of talk and interaction, and the role that technology plays in this kind of event. And finally, it forced us to consider not only these things separately, but how they had synergies between and among them. So let's take a closer look at how this framework is used in the context of SBA. But before I do that again, I'd just like to take another little poll here and see how you're doing here on this.
I'm going to launch this. There's 2 questions in this one and only 1 choice for each.
Actually, in the second question, Sophie, I suppose there could be more than one answer, but I suppose we can't mix methods, right?
Well, I think at this point, I can't, well, we could have done multiple, but everybody, I guess, choose the one you think the most.
Yeah, I'll be curious about that.
But yeah, I guess we could have made it more than one choice. And I'll leave this one up for a little while too, just like the last one. People are responding much more quickly this time. I guess there's less to read for this question.
I'm curious if they had to choose number 2. I'm curious which ones they would choose.
There's a clear winner already, and I'll let you guess while we're waiting.
Really curious.
That's almost everybody. I'll just wait one more moment for people to reply. I think we've got nearly everyone now. Okay, do you want to see it? Do you want to see the results?
Yeah,
Let's
sure.
see them. Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Okay, yes, of course, and that's the correct answer. That is the correct answer. We can use the same framework to conceptualize pedagogy and also assessment. I just spent, the last year and a half working on using this framework to conceptualize pedagogy in the Algerian context. And then the second one, people put proficiency. I would have put proficiency too if I had to choose between them. But traditionally, we think of the interaction of the first 3. Traditional assessments are, proficiency and elicitation, how you get the answer to that. More modern assessments are, how that relates to a context. And these other dimensions aren't necessarily included in these assessments. Okay, that's great. Let's move on. So let's think about scenario-based assessment as a technique for assessing a situated second language proficiency. So what is scenario-based assessment? Well, first of all, it's not a theory, it's a technique that's used to present examinees with a sociocultural context in which an examinee, as a fully contributing member of an imaginary team, has to work collaboratively to solve a problem. And the problem is contextualized within a scenario with a coherent and carefully sequenced set of independent and integrated scenes as part of that narrative, and it's meant to reflect the habits of mind of proficient problem solvers. The scenario context requires examinees to engage in, display, develop even, and coordinate a range of topical, sociocognitive, linguistic, and dispositional resources while moving through the assessment. And the problem is intended to be really a worthwhile educational experience in its own right. We take that very seriously with the expectations that people will actually learn something new in the assessment. So examinees are expected in this approach to come to the scenario with different levels of background knowledge. We know they do, and we just expect it. Nonetheless, the great thing about this is the scenario aims to provide those with little background knowledge the opportunity to build background, to build knowledge while solving the problem. So for issues of equity and social justice, I think this is a really, really important topic that could be exploited much more. And like in real life, people are given the opportunity to get assistance and feedback within the assessment domain. This is, in this view, it's not cheating, it's just mapping onto an assessment what we do in real life. So the scenario narrative creates a collaborative social context in which examinees can interact socially with imaginary characters online. And they do, in doing this, they deconstruct the problem, they figure out a strategy for solving it, they assist each other linguistically, topically, emotionally. And this is really the role of some of the chats that you will see later on in the example. Okay. Finally, the SBAs are digitally delivered to capitalize on technological innovations that are relevant to the design system and actually to be able to promote digital literacy skills in the examinees. I want to acknowledge our inspiration for this, and also for further reading, Randy Bennett from ETS and a number of people from ETS, John Sabatini, Tanae O'Reilly, all these people have been working on this for a long time, and I've worked with them on many things, and so I just want to acknowledge the fact that my inspiration comes from them. So in terms of the assessment that we designed, what were our design assumptions here? One, we wanted to have real world competencies, and you can think of these as validity claims as well, to a certain extent. Real world competencies that were used as a starting point for the scenario, that are organized around these habits of mind. And then the scenario was engineered, and I like to use that word, to take place in a sociocultural context involving imaginary characters assuming different roles and interacting with each other throughout the event. And that took some engineering, let me tell you, it did. Okay. The scenario was designed to allow us to measure the examinee's ability to get at these second language communication skills. So these are the high level skills, the ability to collaboratively build and share knowledge so they can actually accomplish the scenario goal, that major competency or those competencies. But it was also designed to get at some of the second language foundational skills, topical knowledge before the scenario and after the scenario, where we were able to look at gains that are made in topical knowledge. And you'll see this a little bit later, how we operationalize that. The scenario was designed to allow us to present examinees with informational input, in other words, instruction, and that instruction had to be processed and remembered and incorporated into their responses. So this is also something you don't get in a traditional type of assessment. The scenario was designed to allow us to present examinees with feedback. So we did give them feedback, just like in real life, we get feedback. And that had to be processed and incorporated into their responses once again. And the scenario was designed to be engaging. And finally, the scenario participation allowed us to track and examine these examinees' digital literacy skills. All right, so the LOA and the ECD frameworks were used to guide design and operationalization processes. And then the LOA framework in conjunction with Kane's framework was used to guide the examination of validity claims. I don't have much time here to get into these two things, but these are very interesting topics on how we did this as well. All right, so let's go with an example of a scenario-based assessment. This is one that we've used as a placement exam at Teachers College. It is still in design. It's in research. It's actually in research phase 2, version 2. I'm showing you stuff from version 1 here. So it's for our adult ESL program. It's a lab school for second language teacher education. Also, it's used for TESOL and applied linguistics research. And we have a placement exam. And in this exam, the way we want to use this is new students taking the test are streamed. They come to TC, they're streamed into the appropriate scenario-based on their grammar test. So they first take a grammar screening test, and that tells us whether they should go into the 8-2 scenario, the B1 plus level scenario, or the advanced level scenario. So these scenarios will be they're pretty different, okay, in terms of what we can measure. So this is where I'm gonna focus today on the intermediate level scenario. All right, so what's the scenario? So when they come here, they begin with a group project. So you see Miss Perez here. She's the simulated teacher, and she serves as the guide through the entire scenario. She has the social authority to be able to do that, okay? We wanted to frame the project within a goal-oriented collaborative problem-solving event. So she says, you know, our classes receive some funds on a group trip to a foreign country. We're going to do a project. And in this project, you know, you're going to write a proposal together, and you're going to send a proposal to the selection committee, and the committee that wins is going to get we're going to go on that trip. So it's kind of like gamified in that way. And then she sets it up and says, you'll work with 3 peers to research 2 destinations, and we want you to try to present a compelling proposal in the end for the preferred destination. So basically, the examinee sits there, works with people online, they're imaginary, so he or she is representing, you are representing as the examinee, your peers online, and you interact with them. And then you need to send that at the very end to the selection committee. All right, so one thing that we have in the terms of the social context, we have people doing chats. So these chats are animated actually. And these are the 3 peers, the simulated peers. And the purpose here is to provide the social context for collaborative work. And the chats have several functions, as I mentioned before in in one of the slides. They do a lot of different types of things. Also, a very, very important part of the scenario are these habits of mind. So first of all, as I said, people come in, they do this grammar test. And then the first thing they do is we give them a pre-scenario topical knowledge test. This is their background knowledge test. We give them the same test at the very end, okay? And then they enter the scenario. Once they take this test, they enter the scenario. So the first part of the scenario has 3 parts. The purpose is to build, consolidate, and share knowledge. And so first they get a reading task about Vietnam, and they answer questions. And then they get a categorization task where they have to categorize the pros and cons, and they'll get corrective feedback on that. And then then we give them some instruction about summary writing. Okay, and then they're given a summary writing task, and this is their first writing task. Okay, we don't assume as a placement exam they come and they know about summary writing, so we give them explicit instruction. The second part is same thing we're trying to do in terms of the key practices, build, consolidate, and share knowledge. But now we're doing this we're using listening, and instead of talking about Vietnam here, now we're talking about Jordan. So they listen to videos. They answer questions, they do a categorization task of the pros and cons, get some corrective feedback on it. And this time we take away the explicit feedback, and then we have them write the summary task 2, including both the pros and cons. Then they're given a task where we don't score. It's a synthesizing task where they have to make a group decision, and they got to prepare their pitch, okay, that they're going to give to the committee. And then finally, we give them, we ask them to do a speaking task where they make the pitch. This is where they use the information they have above in order to be able to argue their point. And then finally, they have the topical knowledge test. So there are a number of different, this is a complex assessment. There are a number of different tasks. So this is what the pre-scenario topical task looks like. It's basically, some pictures, and we wanted to get information. They're allowed to say, I don't know, notice. The purpose is to activate and measure background knowledge about the destinations before the scenarios. And we're trying to get factual information and lexical information. Then they go into a reading task. And of course, my phone has to ring right now. And so in this reading task, hold on, I'm just gonna hello, goodbye. Okay, all right, so they get a reading task here, and where they read, and it looks like an actual forum, and this is one of the performance indicators, and the purpose is to measure their ability to understand literal and implied meanings that are expressed in the text. Okay, then after the reading task, they get what is called a categorization task. This is where we want them to consolidate their understandings from the reading. And all of this, the same thing happens with listening. I'm not going to go through the reading and the listening. The listening is modeled the same way after the reading, except for you have videos instead of text. And so then there's a categorization task where they go and they put in the pros and cons. It's not related, information not related, or it's the wrong information. Okay. And then this is what we call a performance moderator. It's a categorizing task. And we're trying to get at the ability to categorize information about each destination. And then after this, they're given some feedback on it, on whether they got what the answer they put, and whether they got the answer right or wrong, and what the right answer is. So this is, again, feedback on the categorizing task. And the reason why we did with this was to provide information, the correct information, because they're going to be able to write, they'll be better suited to write a summary about this if they have the correct information on it. Okay. Then later on, we give them we ask them to write a summary, but we give them some instruction first. So one part of the instruction, some explicit instruction on summary writing, is to have them look at a text. As you can see, this is all moderated by the characters. Lee says, I looked at how Kathy wrote her cons paragraph. It's interesting. She mentioned a con, and then, they go through this task. The purpose of this is to provide examinees with a model text and guidelines to help them actually write the summary. Okay. And then they're given the first writing task with the guidelines there. And, Anna basically tells them how to do this. This is all being moderated with these characters. They're leading us through this. And then they have to write the summary. And this is a performance. This is an integrated writing task, but it's with assistance here. The next one is going to be without assistance. And it's to measure their ability to write a summary following the instructional piece. So we go through the listening task as well, and the exact same procedure for listening, all those different tasks. And then we have them write after the listening task. So this is summary writing too. And here they need to, we're measuring their ability to write a summary, but this time they're not really given that explicit instruction. They still have access to the guidelines and some of the information from the pros and cons, but they're not really given any more instruction after the first piece of instruction. Okay. Then we come to the final task, which is the speaking task, where they have to make a pitch. This is the scenario goal. Ms. Perez jumps back in there again to give some instructions and to provide them with a list of some of the pros and cons of both Jordan and Vietnam, which were listed. So it's not a memory task, so they're able to write from this. So this is a performance indicator, and the purpose is to measure their ability to make a persuasive pitch. Okay, if you can see that there's a simulated committee here that they're making this pitch for, and there's scaffolding for potential organization of the content, and also this is an example of scaffolding of the content of the pitch, but also we give them for potential organization of the pitch as well. We're just showing you the one. Then at the very end of it, they're given the same topic, this topical knowledge task. And this is, at this time, it's really topical knowledge. It's not background knowledge, because hopefully they learn something. And this allows us to determine some of the gains they might have made throughout the scenario. I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to ask Sophie if there are any questions you want to add to if there are any questions so far right now that I can answer. I'll take one or two, Sophie.
Sure, I'll head to the Q&A portion. And I guess I'll probably just start from the top. So our first question is, what are the differences between scenario-based instructions and task-based teaching or project-based instructions?
Can you do me a favor and can you ask that same question at the very end of the talk?
Yes, I sure
Okay,
can.
because I have 2 slides because I knew that question was going to come up.
Gotcha, sure.
Okay.
Let's see, next question we have is, how would we implement scenario-based tasks in resource depleting areas? Who people have limited access to a real-life language uses environment?
So this was a technology question, right?
I think so.
Yeah, I think, yeah, if you don't have the technology, you can't really do this very well, obviously, because this is delivered online. But we've actually given this in several different countries, and people have been able to do it online pretty well. We haven't had very many problems with that. We give them at first, before we have them do it, we have a familiarization video. We have them do it. We send them some information on how to actually set up their computer to make it work. And then once they do that, then we allow them to have access to the actual test. If any of you out there are interested in doing this and participating with us, and send me an email later on, and would love to have you take the test or participate in it as you in any way that we can. But we're always trying to look at we're always sensitive to the technology. And when I was in Algeria, when doing my work in Algeria, it's really made me sensitized to that. And so it could be a problem for some countries. Okay. One more, Sophie?
So I have a question I'll kind of ask it, it's similar questions, but so is it correct to say that scenario-based learning provides more meaningful EFL teaching? And is it the best option for a successful learning process?
So I don't know if it's the best, because I don't know what it's compared to. Okay, so, but I think it's a really good way. If you want to provide people with trying to do something that we do in real life and give them experience doing things that we do in real life, then I think it's a really meaningful way for them not only to be able to use their language knowledge, but also to develop understandings about a topic. I think that's the thing that we're most excited about, is being able to learn something in the test. And you'll see at the very end what I mean by that. Being able to, you're taught this and you get a test on that that's very similar to that. And so it just expands your understandings and a little bit more. So I think obviously I'm sold into it. It's kind of project-based, scenario-based, it's very similar. Okay, I'm going to move on, Sophie, and then we can get to some of these really great questions at the end, okay?
Sure.
All right, so how have we scored this? Okay, a lot of you are probably asking, well, how's he scoring this thing? Well, we're still in the research phase, as I said. So I'm going to just talk about the speaking task itself first, okay? Because I don't have time to do everything else. So when we think about speaking in this very, very last task that you just saw, we are measuring specifically with Rubric's content quality. We want them to say something that is topically accurate and relevant. Accurate meaning that they've learned about it in a scenario. Okay, that comes from that. So it's a content responsible rubric. Also, we want them to we look at content sufficiency. In other words, there's enough development of the topic, and that there's a kind of sophistication of the topic. Because in the very high level performers, you'll get that sophistication. All of this is getting at the propositional resources. So if any of you have read in my stuff, meaning for me is the most important thing that we do with language, is communicating understandings. And so that's front and center in everything that we do. By the same token, we need to use linguistic resources, right? So these semantic, grammatical, and pragmatic resources. And so we do have a rubric for how they're able to organize their response, the logical development, coherence, cohesion. We think about their language control, the forms, accuracy issues, range. Since it's a spoken test, we're looking at their delivery. In other words, some of the phonological and intelligibility issues that we can score for, and then also the fluency issues, the ease of speech with the rhythm, the intonation. Things can really mess up good pronunciation. And then finally, we want to measure, a function, the goal accomplishment. Have they actually met that competency here of persuasiveness? And this gets at functional efficiency. So you'll see them both. So we have rubrics for all of these, and we've scored for them. Okay, so one example of a content elaboration rubric, which I can't go through in detail, but the great thing about webinars is you can go back here and you can look at it a little bit later. This is our content elaboration rubric, and then we also have here's our persuasiveness rubric that we've gone through, and we have, and that's about all I'm going to talk about in terms of that. How does this convert into a score report? So this again is really important for us to give them a learning-oriented score report. What we do in this is we give them overall scores here of how much they got correct at this point. We haven't done standard setting yet. We haven't done a lot of other things. We're just giving them in this phase, what they got correct, the percentage they got correct. So they have an overview of the entire thing. But section by section in the test, we give them feedback on how they did. We give them a graph on the different types of tasks, and then we give them a little bit of a description of what that means. So the left one is the one on reading comprehension. The one on the right is with writing ability. You can see that it comes directly from the rubric. We give them also a speaking ability score. You can see from the rubric, what they got and how well they performed, and then some kind of a description down below. And the thing that we really are interested in is, did they learn something? So we give them the results of their topical knowledge task, what they learned in the beginning, and then how well they did on that task in the end. And then we give them a little bit of a description with it. Okay, so we want to try to practice what we preach in terms of making the score reports learning oriented, so teachers can use this. We've had a lot of really good feedback on that. All right, so getting now to how am I doing? Okay, I'm going over a little bit. Getting now to how do we make these traditional classroom tests scenario-oriented, scenario-based and learning-oriented. So how do we apply this to classroom-based assessment? So the current SBA was designed for a placement exam. It was engineered to measure a really complex construct of second and foreign language proficiency with collaborative problem solving. We prioritized authenticity, and so we used a very complex design with imaginary characters. So imaginary characters is a key piece here that distinguishes it from task-based to scenario-based. So the SBA required a significant amount of technological expertise to deliver the test, but it's not over the top. It took us going through it. We can train people how to do this pretty fast now. So a classroom test doesn't need to have this complexity. At the same time, without much difficulty, we can create or we can adapt some achievement tests to be scenario-based or learning-oriented. So an example of this is, let's imagine you taught a CLIL EFL class in which you taught a class about ecosystems. The focus was on different types of how different types of human activity can disrupt the ecosystem in the Amazon rainforest. So linguistically, during those lessons, you taught the students how to use hypotheticals and other structures to describe the effect on the ecosystem. But in your test, you don't want to give them a test on the ecosystem. You want to see if they're able to transfer that knowledge to a similar type of context. So in this case, then you use a different type of ecosystem, maybe marine life, okay? So in a traditional test, you would have, you would start off with, basically no specific goal in terms of a context. There's no reason to communicate other than display mastery of the language. But if you converted this into a scenario-based test, you could begin with instructions that say, imagine you are asked to write a short article for a high school science newsletter in which you describe the complexities of an ecosystem. You agree, but before doing so, you need to do some research. Okay, so now you see where I'm going here. Okay, in a traditional test, you get the reading comprehension task. They read this wetlands passage and they select the correct answers. Also, there's a passage and there are some multiple choice questions. And that's the traditional. In the scenario based, so instead of calling it reading comprehension, it's learning about ecosystems. Once again, we're going to keep with that theme. Okay, the instructions, so read the passage and answer the multiple choice questions. When finished, you'll receive feedback on your answers. This is not hard to do in Google Forms. Okay, try to remember the important information so you can write about it later in the newsletter. So now we're trying to make it content responsible. Okay, so they read the same passage, students answer the questions, designed to measure, instead of the skill-based, designed to measure their ability to understand literal and implied meanings in the text, which is a different take on the construct. And then they get part B of that task. Here they look at the correct answers and they clarify their answers. And again, they're reminded, try to remember the important information for later. Part C is now write 2 important takeaways from the passage to remember, so that you might want to include in your newsletter. Okay, so now we're taking notes here, and each response could be scored for topical accuracy. Okay, and then they get a part, and so now they have those 2 pieces of information. In section 2 of the test, the grammar test, in the traditional test, fill in the blank with a correct answer. They get a gapped passage. There's another passage about wetlands with 10 targeted grammar items. Okay, students fill in the gaps with the correct structures. In the learning oriented one, it's part 2, learning more about ecosystems. So in this case, the instructions are read the passage and fill in the blanks with the correct forms. When finished, you will receive feedback on your answers again. But again, try to remember the important information so that you can write about it later on. Okay, so we're not using that passage just for language, we're using it for content as well. And so they get the gap passage on the wetlands with 10 targeted grammar items, and they have to fill in the blanks with that. But then there's a part B to this. So look at the correct answers, clarify your understandings, and try to remember the important information in your newsletter. Okay, they get a part C on this. Write 1 important takeaway from the passage to remember that you might want to include in your newsletter. Okay, and then that response gets a score for topical accuracy. Okay, part 3 of the test, the final part of the test, is writing. So the instructions in the traditional test are look at the graphic of the ecosystem and write a description of the effects on the ecosystem if the heron died out. Okay. They receive the input is a graphic of the ecosystem with lexical items that are labeled. And then the student has to use the graphic to write about the effects of the ecosystem if the heron, I first said perch, died out. And they're scoring us for topical, rhetorical, and language control. In the learning oriented piece, now they say part 3 is write an article for a science newsletter. Okay. In part A, look at the graphic of the ecosystem and 3 ideas, and write 3 ideas about what would happen to the ecosystem if the heron died out. Okay, they get the graphic of the ecosystem with the labels, and then they have blanks for them to write these 3 sentences, and these are scored again. Then you get part B of this. Look at the takeaways from the 2 passages before and your ideas, or the 2 or 3 passages before. Okay, your ideas about the wetlands. And all of this is populated here. From what you had before, you need to populate it right here in this part of the assessment. So use this information to write a newsletter online about the wetlands ecosystem. So now they're using all of the information that they have. Remember to include an introduction and a conclusion. Use formal scientific language in your article, and then the students get a blank and have to write the article, and they're scored once again for topical, rhetorical, and language control. And you might imagine that the essays in part 2 are probably going to look a lot different from the essays in part 1. So that's kind of how there are a number of different features here that were included implicitly in the part 2 task. And I'm not going to go over these features right now. We're coming on 2:30 here. Wait, it's 1:30. So we're good. So I will go over them because I do have some time here. So there are some contextual features that are specified in the real-world competency task, the newsletter. From the elicitation dimension, it reflects these real-life competencies in that each component has several subtasks that build off one another, leading to that culminating task of writing the article. Also, the test has a coherent narrative revolving around a scenario. Now, if you really wanted to make this into a formal scenario-based assessment, you could include some other things in this. You could include the characters that lead them through this. You could include some instructions along the way that you might want to add into this. So there are other types of features that could be included in this. This task also gets at the proficiency dimension that measures a student's ability to use a full array of these linguistic resources. And these are to activate, build, consolidate, and share topical information during the course of the test. And actually, students are expected to develop topical understandings, especially in the second part of the test. There's an instructional dimension in it, in that they need to, there's input in there, there's 2 passages, there's a graphic, and then they're given feedback. So there's some instruction in that. And then sociocognitively, they need to basically process the information they get. They need to process the feedback they get, and they need to remember some of it as they go along. So it uses the post-reading and post-grammar tasks to force students to consolidate their understandings, and they do this in this situated in the scenario where you have situated cognition that permeates the entire thing. In terms of the affective dimension, we tried it. I think the second task is, it was engineered to be cognitively engaging and interesting. So the hopes of helping students to try hard in that real world task, to help them remember things and engage with it more than just answering questions. There was a social interactional dimension, but not a really strong one, because we didn't have the peers. We did have a social contract in that, we're writing for a specific audience here. And then people need to have technological skills in order to, and digital literacy skills in order to be able to perform this type of task online. So with that, I hope I've given you an example of how we can take some of our classroom tests and convert them into more scenario oriented and actually more learning oriented, hopefully in the end. And I'm going to stop there, and I just want to thank you for your attention. And I think we can open it up now to a discussion. So thank you.
Well, we have been, thank you so much. Excellent. Okay, so I think, let me see, I'll start at the top. I know there was a question you wanted me to revisit, which was, what are the differences between scenario-based instruction and task-based teaching or project-based instruction?
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, so theoretically, so let me start from this here. I need to. So typically what we had in the traditional way basically is using a skills-based approach, where you have 4 different skills and you have different kinds of items that are with different types of readings and listenings, and you read one thing, forget it, and then you read another one, you answer the questions, forget it, and you read another. So this is kind of a skills-based approach. And if we add all these things up, then we call that second language or foreign language proficiency. So this addresses really well kind of the proficiency dimension and the elicitation dimension, but it doesn't really provide that much of a context on this. Even though there could be a contextual dimension, but usually in these kinds of tests, it's pretty impoverished. And some of the other dimensions, they're engaged, but they're not really explicit. Okay. We could do this in a little bit of a better way, more modernly, with if we do some integrated skills tasks, and a lot of like ETS has been doing this, and this is much better way to do this, where you have more context here. We're getting into proficiency and elicitation dimension, but we've got more context, and we implicitly are getting at some of the sociocognitive dimension and some of these other dimensions. Okay, moving further along is we could do this in this is a task-based way of doing this. So this is where you have test one, where you look at a chart and you've got a task related to test one. They examine the flow chart, they write an accurate thing, and then they have now a completely different task, possibly test at two, where you have them do something different and you follow the same way of doing this. In this case, it gets pretty well at the proficiency dimension. It can measure both the accomplishment of the task, and it can get at some of the linguistic resources if the task-based approach gets at those linguistic resources. Some task-based approaches don't really want to get at them. They just want to get at the can-do statement of the functional proficiency here. This also is complex in terms of its tasks. It's not based on a scenario. It might be loosely based on habits of mind, but not necessarily like a scenario-based assessment is. And in this one here, there is more specification of a task context here, which with these different types of tasks. What's not maybe specifically specified in some of this, but it definitely is getting at this, is the sociocognitive dimension. We've got people have written about discourse synthesis and processing in these integrated tasks, and also learning from or feedback. They're not really in the design that I could see. And other types of dimensions aren't necessarily, they're engaged, but they're not necessarily an explicit part of that design. So moving beyond that, so what is, if we move to a scenario-based assessment, which is very close to task-based assessment, we're going to add some different features here. And so the types of features that we would have is, first of all, we have an overarching goal of the scenario that's very linked up. It's got, if we just organize this based on key practices, we are building understandings by reading. We're sharing understandings by writing summaries. We're building understandings by listening. I'm over here. We're sharing understandings. We're synthesizing them. And we're sharing understandings by making a presentation where we have everything is really closely connected in the resolution of the scenario. Plus also what you don't have in task-based is you don't have this simulated guide that's going through all the way through, leading the person through the scenario. And you don't have a lot of the sociocultural interplay through the chats and how students are actually working together in the scenario to get them to their goal, where we're trying to we do this through animation, so it really looks like someone is typing a text message here as they go through it. It really makes it feel kind of real to them. So in this kind of an approach, it is driven by its contextual dimension. It's one coherent situation designed around a competency. It revolves around a sequence of independent and integrated tasks that are organized based on these habits of mindful problem solving. The proficiency dimension is very clear in terms of the measurement, both levels of task achievement and the foundational skills, so we can provide people with feedback on that. We assume from the beginning that there's going to be a lot of social cognition going on here. It's explicit in the design, and we assume that people are going to learn things. We also assume that people are going to be taught things, and it's explicit. We think about how to present that information to people. We know that people's affect is going to be engaged through the entire thing. We've studied that in our validation work. So that's a really important part of how we've designed this. And then the whole thing kind of works through the social interactional dimension, where people are, taking turns developing topics, and it's all related to who they're speaking to in the social contract. So this is a much more specified than I've seen, at least in the task-based assessments that are out there. I hope I answered whoever's question about that, but I knew this question was going to come up.
Okay, so I see a few questions about this, about scoring. So one person asks how rater training and scoring works in this technique. And also are students aware of how they're being rated or scored in this kind of assessment?
So let's go to rater scoring. So the way we score this, you saw this this piece here. Where is it? It's over here. So if you look at this rubric here, Okay, let me share my, let me go back here. All right, so if you look at this rubric, this is online as it is. What a rater does is they will get a link to a speech sample. Right there, you will, and at that so you listen to the speech sample, you will see this, oops, go back. You'll see this in front of you. And what you'll do is you will read the rubric, okay? And you will click. If I click here, then they get a 5. And then it takes you to the next rubric. Okay, you click on the next rubric and you get a 6 or 7, and it takes you to the next group. So it's just a matter of scoring is very easy to do. It took us a while to do this online, but it's like click here, read the rubric, click. It's not papers and stuff like that, going all through things. You can listen to the sample anytime you want. And then at the very end, it's just, we can download those scores very, very easily. So that's how scoring happens. They get links to either text or to or speech samples. And then training on this, well, you need to go through a training process. I mean, we all went through a training process ourselves by training on looking at different texts. It took us a long time to come up with these rubrics. They're still, like any rubric, in development. But we've trained a number of people now to actually be able to score these. And we're doing this now in Italian and in Korean and in Farsi and other languages. So we have some experience with scoring. So those are the 2 things they asked about. And what was the other? Do learners know about how we score them?
Yes.
So, turn this away. Okay. So when we first did this, no, learners did not know how we were doing this because we didn't know how we were going to do it. Okay. But when they got the score reports, the scores were they definitely saw the score reports, which are very, very closely associated with the rubrics. We haven't given them the rubrics yet because we haven't done the kinds of analyses that I feel comfortable before we make them public. But they will definitely see how they're being scored later on, and that appears in the score report.
Gotcha.
Thank you for that question.
I've got another one. This one's a little longer. So this question from Timothy Hall. So sociocultural folks centralize the integration of multiple semiotic systems, including language, and don't like to think about language as decontextualized from those systems. Looking at a learner's language use in the context of scenario-based assessment, to what extent are learners' use of other semiotic tools considered or assessed in this framework?
So what do you mean by semiotic tools? We can't have this discussion, can we?
I guess it's a little tricky in this current format, unless Timothy Hall, you want to add into the chat.
Tim, I'm not sure what you mean by semiotic tools. Do you mean just meaning structures?
Possibly. I'm not seeing anything from the chat. How about this? We'll give Timothy a second if he wants to add to the chat, and I'll ask you another question in the meantime. How about that?
Tim usually asks really good questions, so I'm really interested in finding out the answer, but maybe a little bit later.
Okay, let's see. So here's one. The construct for SBA is context specific and narrow. This is Jing Zhu. They assume the performance in SBA cannot be extrapolated to context beyond the scenario. So how feasible would it be to create various scenarios to adequately represent or cover the target language use domain?
I am so glad you asked that question. I knew someone else, that's probably a tester out there, I don't know who it is, a smart tester out there saying, well, what about generalizability? Okay. So, we can look at generalizability in a whole wide range of ways. One way is to look at generalizability in terms of, do the scores generalize across facets like raters and text and things like that? Yeah, we can get that kind of the low-hanging fruit as far as I'm concerned. And so those, and you can get generalizability based on that. But what we're really trying to do is we're trying to take a real situation of language use. And we're using this in a collaborative problem-solving task, which is probably one of the most complex that I can think of. And there are a lot of different things that are happening here. And we've tried to our very best to try to make this similar to what people are doing in real life. We really have tried to think it through. And if someone thinks that we haven't done this or could help us do it better, we would really love that. So I think that there's the generalizability that you get from the ability to go through this process. Okay, it's authenticity of task, to go through the process, and then at each stage you're measured and you're given feedback on this, or you're measured and you're trying to see how you perform. And at the very end, can you actually perform this task by marshaling all of these resources? I think in its own right, that is generalizable to any kind of other problem-solving tasks. So now what we could do, where we could go is, there are other types of tasks besides collaborative problem solving, right? We could do a task that looks at one of the other key practices in Song and Dean's work, okay? And I have a student now who's looking at, a couple students who are looking at this. How do we design this scenario based on how people develop, for example, a research project? Okay, how do they come up with the question? How do they think about conceptualizing it? How do they, a science project? How do they go through these different stages? And so so it's very similar to this in that you need to get information, you need to work with other people, you need to reason through it. You need to get feedback on what you're doing, and then you need to come up with you need to look at the results, and you need to interpret them, and you need to present them in some kind of a forum. So the multiple components that you would have in this context are probably going to be pretty similar to some of the components that you would have in a different context. And so, or in a different context. So I think in terms of generalizability, I think this is the actual strength of the scenario-based assessment. I don't think it's a weakness of being able to have 25 different types of tasks that get at the one kind of and so I just maybe I'm missing something. Whoever asked this question, and please get in touch with me if I am missing something, and let's have that conversation. Okay, it's too bad that this context doesn't
the only
allow
bad thing about this
conversation.
webinar platform. But I appreciate all your questions. These are great. I've got another one.
Great questions. That was a great question.
Excellent. Okay, so this one is anonymous, but for the travel decision SBA, is background knowledge conceptualized as knowledge of the candidate destination, the process of travel planning, or both? Is background knowledge of travel planning also assessed in this?
So that's a really good question also. We didn't assume that it was planning the trip. Okay, because we didn't model that in this. What we modeled in was, we kind of kept this on the academic road where, what kind of information do you know about Iran if you're going to go to Iran before you go there? Okay, I mean, I'm going to Algeria, next month, and so what do I know about Algeria before I get there? And so, and hopefully by being there and working with people while I'm there, I'm going to learn a lot more about Algeria. So what we modeled it based on two things, basically. When we talk about topical knowledge, really was the information base that you have about the place before you go there, and some of the context specific lexis, that either discipline specific lexis or the context specific lexis that you could develop while going there. And we didn't really include in this, the process of booking a trip, and that is definitely that's topical knowledge. It's based on epistemic knowledge, but we didn't do that. But that might be an interesting scenario actually to get people to do that.
I have another question that just to the length. What is the length of the task, and is there consideration for time and cognitive processing?
Yeah, so I said in the beginning that this is a research version of the test, and the test takes about 2.5 hours to go through. And so that for a placement test, that's not odd, or it's not too long. Okay, for a proficiency test, in some countries, it's very short. Okay, we still think it's too long. Okay, and so what we need to do is we need to collect more data on this, especially on version 2, which we're going to be collecting data soon on, and then get a good enough pool so that we can make real changes to the test and shorten it. And we know how to do that empirically. So that's the one question of, how we can make this test shorter, and we do need to make it shorter. Does that have an impact on sociocognitive impact on people? I think it does. I think obviously, we get tired. We really need to keep a lot of things running in our brain with this kind of test. We try to minimize that by giving them a lot of supports. So if you noticed on the one, let me get rid of this thing here. On the very end here, on this type of a task here, which is the speaking task, we've given them some help here. So it doesn't make it into a total memory task, but they see some of the previous pros and cons on both sides. And then it allows them kind of to bring it together and remember that what was actually in the readings and listening. So we're not trying to, it's not a 100% memory task, but we're trying to rather jog their memory here. And so that kind of minimizes the cognitive load at the very end, at the very end of this task. But it's interesting also to see how many people actually went with this in their speaking samples, and then also included other kinds of background information on it. That was, they really did engage with this kind of task. So thank you for that question. That was also a great question.
Yeah. Now, I know we're coming up on time. Do we have time for one more question, do you think, or should we wrap it up? I've got a short one for you. We've got one that says, can virtual reality be one type of scenario-based assessment? Thoughts on that?
So, I don't know enough about virtual reality to say how, but I will definitely say yes. Okay. I just don't know, that much about it, and I would love to learn more about it. But I can definitely see that being playing I think that's the next generation of this. I really do. I think it's next generation. It's not maybe in 2025, maybe in 2028, we might be able to have what we're trying to do here in the context of virtual reality. And I think that would be awesome. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a cool area to look at the potential for. Okay, I wonder if, I don't know. I think we never heard back from Timothy, so I don't know if we can follow up, but hopefully he will find you out there.
Tim, you know where to find me. Okay.
You can discuss it into the future. I think we should probably wrap it up. Anthony, would you like to say anything?
Yes.
A few words?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks. That was a very insightful and persuasive talk on using scenario-based assessment with the example from ESL. I just want to inform all the people who watch the webinar that Jim's group has done research on SBA in other languages, not just English. At the LTRC and AAAL conferences, which were held a month ago, Jim and his group presented work from Farsi, Korean, and Italian, so and more to come. So maybe Arabic. So
Arabic is almost we're giving the final training session this Friday, actually next Friday.
Yeah. So those of you who are interested in following Jim's journey on
Korean,
scenario-based
Persian,
assessment,
Italian, and Arabic.
Yeah, get in touch with him or his group members. Can you put your group members once more back again there?
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, Heidi and Payman and Jorge, Suhyung, Dan, and Juwan, Nahal, Sabrina, and Atta.
And their groups.
Yeah,
and
that's the whole
group. The group leads. So if you go to this website here, if you go to this website, you'll see everybody who's involved in it, past and present. If you want to connect with us in any way, there's a place to do that on the website. And, you know, we'll be really happy to talk to you if you're doing this kind of work as well, to kind of bring our brains together on this whole thing. I know it's not
I
for
just added that
everybody.
link to the chat too, so you could click it. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. As you close out of this, I think that Zoom will show you a brief survey. We just want to collect impressions about this webinar and make sure that we're catering this to topics that you're all interested in out there. For those of you asking, we have recorded this session. It might take us a few days to turn it around, but once we've processed it and uploaded it, we'll put that on our YouTube channel, and we'll send out an email with the link to that, and we'll keep you all posted for the next installment in this series. And we welcome your suggestions about topics or speakers that you'd like to see in future in this series.
Thanks again, everybody, for coming, and thank you guys as well. This has been great.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Sophie. Bye for now.